Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Daniel Tichenor, the first Senior Faculty Fellow at the Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics, and the Philip H. Knight Professor of Social Science in the Department of Political Science. Dan is a scholar of American political thought and history and has published extensively on immigration policy and politics, the American presidency, public policy, organized interests and social movements, and inequality in the U.S. His book, Dividing Lines, The Politics of Immigration Control in America, published in 2002, won the 2003 Gladys M. Kammerer Award for the best book in American national policy. Dan has held numerous research posts, including positions at Princeton University, the Brookings Institute, the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, and the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers. He has testified for the U.S. House Judiciary Committee on Immigration Reform and provided expert briefings on American immigration policy and history for the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. Dan is currently finishing another book, Presidential Prerogatives, on presidential power, civil liberties, and democracy in times of crisis. Dan, thanks for coming to talk to us on UO Today.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're especially glad to get you because you're just coming to the end of your first academic year at the University of Oregon, right?
That's correct, yes.
So you've seen us through a whole cycle by now, or just about.
That's right.
I wanted to ask you about your work at the Wayne Morse Center. You have an initiative called Politics and Policy, and I was hoping you would describe that.
Yes, I'd be happy to. The Morse Center is really a wonderful place for me because it promotes public scholarship, and so part of this initiative is indeed to help in celebrating and magnifying the research of UO scholars who are doing work that is publicly engaged, that gets them out of the ivory tower, that addresses real-world problems, and also to help those who might be inclined to do so, to help make those connections with the community, with public servants and so forth. And so some of the specific things we're doing is we have an ongoing colloquium series where scholars who are doing work that addresses public policy, democratic politics, kind of significant issues in local, state, and national political life, have a chance to talk about their research with one another, present papers, and indeed the price of admission is everyone has read in advance, and so they provide lots of constructive feedback. So it's really kind of a workshop environment for people to roll up their sleeves and talk about their work. Another component of this is to invite distinguished external scholars to campus who again are doing research or have scholarship that really speaks to public problems, to critical issues in American life. And then another component of this is a specific initiative that really comes out of my own research expertise and interest, which is to bring together this really impressive pool of talented migration scholars on campus and also in the area at other institutions as well to what we hope will be a kind of new study group on U.S. immigration policy, and it will be across various disciplines and will build on some excellent leadership in this regard that Robert Bussell and Lynn Stephen and other scholars on campus have already begun. And so we hope this will generate public-oriented scholarship, as well as more hands-on elements of this, potentially helping with secondary teachers in the state, and providing feedback at both the national and state level.
I'm just curious how you do that when you first arrive in a new community. It must have been hard work to figure out who all is working along similar lines, for example, and how best to reach out.
Well, with a lot of help from my friends. I mean,
right.
Basically, it hasn't been hard work at all because of colleagues at the university who are kindred spirits in being interested in immigration and having a chance through them to network and connect with each other. And so that's really been enormously helpful. And so that's made this task a lot easier. But indeed, there has been, particularly in trying to reach out to other campuses, that has required some heavy lifting to figure out what other talent is out there to help us with this. So with any luck, a few months from now, we'll have something that's really off and running.
Was this a new component to this particular job at U of O, or were you doing anything similar at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was absolutely doing something quite similar at Eagleton, where we had an immigration program that I launched that was plugged into the state, where a commission was formed by New Jersey Governor Corzine, where a number of our working group members had become very much engaged as expert advisors to that process, but then also was very comparable in having a colloquium series, kind of a brown bag lunch group that would get together to talk about one another's research and provide some useful and constructive feedback. So yeah, I'm drawing from a model that worked before.
So you're used to working in this way.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
And I know you're very good at getting out of the ivory tower, because you really do take your expertise into the public realm with your expert testimonies, for example. Do you enjoy that part of the job?
I do. It often depends on who the leadership of the committee is
Right.
That I'm doing it, and I don't mean that in a partisan sense. I mean that in, to what extent are they knowledgeable about the issue? To what extent do they want to go beyond demagoguery on a very hot button issue, and really dig into the problems associated with it? And in this regard, I feel like I've been fortunate so far.
May you continue to
yes,
be fortunate on
thank
that
you.
level.
Thank you.
Much of your work, Dan, has been focused on immigration policy in the U.S., and I know that you talk in your publications about American nativist movements. Can you talk about some of the factors that shape that issue for this country?
Yeah, sure. As a country, we're kind of distinctive in the sense that we've always kind of envisioned ourselves as a nation of immigrants. Indeed, the process of immigration has often been described as a very virtuous one from a broad set of activists on the issue over time. And so, whereas in other countries, immigration itself is viewed as a threat, in the United States, the norm has been to celebrate our immigrant past and to dread the immigrant present. And so the target of our angst surrounding newcomers often changes, but many of the themes are quite similar. And so the factors, religious differences, racial differences, ethnic differences, and it need not be a dramatic change in the volume of immigration. Sometimes that's been the case. When Irish Catholics and German Catholics were arriving in large numbers in the 1840s, 50s, and onward, that triggered a very vociferous anti-Catholic nativism associated first with the Know Nothing movement and later the American Protective Association. But it also has been directed against those who might be arriving in very small numbers, but are viewed as racially threatening, like the Chinese on the West Coast, and the draconian policies and dreadful violence that community was subjected to. Certainly, economic tensions, downturns can have a dramatic effect, and not necessarily on a national level. It can often be on a very local level. So the initial xenophobic or anti-Chinese movement really reflected not just ongoing racial animosities, but some specific problems with the labor market in California that helped explode that particular nativist movement. So,
you know, it occurs to me that I should have asked you before you gave me that answer to define what a nativist approach is. Would you mind just defining that one quickly?
No, I would be happy to. Basically, the short version would be a certain conception of nationalism about who's in and who's out, and one that tends to be kind of backward-looking. That views an earlier group as having a special claim on belonging, as reflecting kind of national cultural values, and viewing certain newcomers or certain groups as outsiders who are incapable of being assimilated.
So whatever current thinking is along those lines will depend on where we are in our history as a nation. And also you mentioned what's going on in the economy. You said sometimes in a downturn, our thinking about immigration will change.
That's exactly right.
So what's happening now in this very significant downturn?
Yes, well, I'm always reluctant to look in the crystal ball. Political scientists have a mixed history when we try to look into the future on these things. But what's clear is that when there is high unemployment and concern about the nation's economic future, that's precisely the time when most people are feeling less compassionate, less with regard to immigrants, less cosmopolitan in their outlook and so forth. It has not always resulted in restrictive policies. Sometimes the country has decided, as we did in 1978-79, another time of stagflation, to study the issue more and think carefully about it before acting. And so there isn't necessarily a direct kind of mechanistic relationship between economic downturns and our immigration policy. Sometimes immigration policy has been very insulated from that. But there's no question that public opinion tends to be less favorable towards expansions in immigration opportunities during those periods. I mean, the other factor I should mention really briefly is just national security jitters are another thing that has often kind of spurred nativist movements as well.
That all makes very good sense. So at the moment, what kind of currents of thought are going on in Congress and elsewhere about immigration issues? Can you give us a summary, or is it too unclear for the moment?
No, I think it's not too unclear. And I should clarify, by the way, that not all restrictive positions on immigration are nativist. Far from it. There are many who have staked out positions saying that we need to, curtail the levels of immigration and so forth, who may come to this from a decidedly economic perspective that may not necessarily be tinged with xenophobia. The organized labor movement traditionally in this country had taken a very restrictive position on immigration, the American Federation of Labor and so forth. To summarize, in Congress, the parties are deeply divided on this issue. Immigration is one of those questions that defies the typical bifurcation of our political system. It's not a red versus blue state, Republican Democratic issue. It really has transcended liberal conservative ideology. So in fact, the most intense battles are often within each of the parties. So as we witnessed with former President Bush's proposals, the strongest opposition he received on this issue, kind of immigration reform that he had in mind, came from kind of restrictive members of his own party, folks like Tom Tancredo, Conservative Talk Radio, the Pat Buchanans and others, who felt that immigration posed enormous threats, particularly illegal immigration. To grant some kind of amnesty program or legalization would be to reward deviant behavior or unlawful behavior. By contrast, there were fellow conservatives, and conservatives in Congress, and it's very true today as well, the Republicans who were more pro-business in orientation, who embraced free markets, who said, really the key is to link willing workers with willing employers. And let's regularize what is current de facto employment and labor-related migration across the southern border. Within the Democratic Party, President Obama, who just came out recently, and the New York Times had a cover story on this about, he's not very, he doesn't have a lot of specifics in the proposal, which is wise at this point, but is clearly trying to send up some trial balloons to see how Congress and members of his own party will respond to immigration. The Democratic Party has been divided between cosmopolitans who embrace broad immigrant admissions and rights, who feel that we've had a big wink when it comes to the status of undocumented immigrants for a long time, and that it would serve the country's interest to provide some form of earned citizenship. Those cosmopolitans in the party, the Ted Kennedys, Javier Becerras, and others, are going to face opposition from more moderate and conservative Democrats, including a number of very recently elected ones from swing states, who are more reluctant, particularly because of how their constituents feel on this issue, to extend legalization until we know that we have some kind of control over the borders. Their concern is, what if we get 10, 15 years hence and there's a new group of undocumented immigrants, whether it's comparable to today, around 10 or 12 million, or even greater, what do we do then? Is it yet another earned citizenship plan? So they are skeptical about the enforcement side of this and want to see that shored up first.
President Obama has taken on a lot of the big issues in his first few months in office. Do you think immigration is going to come to the fore in his first term?
If it is, it will have to come to the fore this year. It is very unlikely that it will go anywhere during an election year, when all politicians, this issue is often described as the domestic equivalent of a political Vietnam in American politics, because it is so divisive and polarizing and unpredictable. And because it's this sort of minefield, if it is going to be taken on during any time, it would probably need to be this year. It certainly would not be during an election year. But given how ambitious his agenda is, there have been many who have advised him to, in fact, wait till later. One argument would be that while his political capital is highest, and he has such high approval ratings right now is the time for him to exercise leadership on a question that clearly is one that divides so many, to articulate where the administration stands on it, and to be willing to exercise a little courage in this regard. The cautious retort would be, well, you have an economic recovery that's going to consume your time. You have health care and a host of other issues that you need to be concerned with.
So perhaps he should, the one stance would be to leave it alone until some of the other larger issues are under control. But with those test balloons that you mentioned, I guess he'll see whether this is something that can be tackled immediately.
Yes.
Dan, I want to, there's a whole lot more to say about the issue of immigration policy, obviously, and I'm sure I could get you to fill our 30 minutes with no trouble, but I do want to ask you to talk about one of your other major pieces of research, which is the book, for example, that talks about presidents who have led the country during times of crisis. Mm-hmm. You use the term prerogative power as it relates to the presidency. Would you explain that?
I'd be happy to. I'm drawing the phrase from John Locke, the philosopher, who really is describing prerogative power as special emergency power for executives during a crisis of the first order to not just go beyond the letter and the spirit of the law, but sometimes even to violate the law if it serves the national interest. In the case of the philosopher Locke, he said people could judge afterwards whether an executive had acted justly. In the U.S. context, the prerogative presidency really becomes most dramatically illustrated during Abraham Lincoln's tenure in office and the Civil War crisis, where he clearly went beyond the law in a number of cases to meet the crisis.
Are there more recent examples that you can invoke?
Oh yes. So obviously we're coming on the heels of the Bush administration. It's much in the news. The book project itself actually is focused on Lincoln in the Civil War, Woodrow Wilson in the First World War, Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the Second World War, and our current war on terror, which will include Bush and perhaps Obama as well.
Were you perhaps inspired to do this project because of the most recent of these incidents?
I was actually, initially I was spending most of my time interviewing and thinking about prerogative power in the context of the Bush administration and its definitions about when it could actually use discretion with regard to a host of issues from interrogations and debates about the torture memo and so forth. And actually initially wanted to do a very quick foray as a background to think, well, you know, how did things look? And how did presidents like Lincoln, Wilson, and FDR, how did they think about questions of constitutional propriety? Were there moments where they decided to exercise self-restraint? And the other part of the question was, what role did other institutions and actors in the American political system play? Did they impose any checks on the prerogative actions of these executives or not? So it was really a question about the balancing of security and freedom, and whether there was anything left for protecting liberties during these really dire wartime crises. So that ended up becoming a sojourn where I went to the archives and really spent time on these three earlier executives.
I'm really curious to know whether you discovered that the 21st century American ethos is to be less tolerant of the notion of prerogative power, or are there more checks and balances worked into the system now? Have we evolved any since Lincoln's day on our thinking about this collectively?
Well, that's an excellent question. In some ways, there are more sources of restraint. We have a much denser network of civil liberties organizations. The American Civil Liberties Union grew out of the First World War, and there are a variety of advocacy groups that were mobilized to try to protect the freedoms of individuals after 9/11 who may have been kind of special targets of interest and so forth. That's quite different than the World War I experience and World War II. And in doing some research on how journalists covered presidents during this period, during the recent period there are far more questions raised by journalists in terms of the conduct of an executive. And finally, key figures in the Justice Department, like James Comey is a wonderful example, have served as a sort of break. That said, none of those particular restraints served in a significant way to restrain President Bush. And so ultimately my punchline is that it has a lot to do with what kind of internal self-restraint or lack thereof is exercised by presidents. And in that regard, Lincoln stands, to my surprise, at the very top of the pack in exercising some very surprising constitutional propriety and restraint.
So it really comes down to the quality of the person as opposed to the balances built into the system.
I think that's right, and I think it also reflects the historical and institutional context that Lincoln was coming out of, when presidents in normal times exercised far less discretion and saw themselves as servants of political parties in a way that contemporary executives do not.
I know you don't want to look in that crystal ball, but do you think there's any chance that Obama will find his way onto the list of great presidents?
He certainly is well positioned in terms of having broader warrants for power than most presidents.
Say that again. Go back to that sentence. Would you repeat that? He certainly has broader...
He certainly has broader warrants for power.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is he's elected at a time of crisis. He is elected, he comes into office at a time when most Americans have, in a sense, the votes that he received were clearly a rejection of the administration that came before him, and that gives him a large number of, a fair degree of freedom to lead the country in addressing these dramatic economic and foreign policy challenges that are in front of him. So he certainly has the potential to be a great president because of the circumstances. Teddy Roosevelt, somebody who had gargantuan ambitions as a president, actually was jealous of Abraham Lincoln and Woodrow Wilson for serving in times of crisis when he said, I can't be as great as they have the opportunity to be because of these circumstances. That said, one has to perform in responding to these challenges. And the agenda that President Obama faces really are quite staggering. And it's not just on the domestic front. I mean, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had at least 6 years to focus on the domestic front before he had to address the crisis of the Second World War. So while our current economic crisis certainly does not rise to the level of the Great Depression, and the challenges we face in foreign policy don't rise to that of the Second World War, having them together is certainly a significant challenge to try to address.
Roosevelt would have been thrilled. One last quick question, and that is it hard to keep the politics out of political history, especially when you're working on an administration and a president as recent as George W. Bush? Well,
I haven't found it very difficult in the sense that I think one has to allow themselves to be surprised by the results. And so in this regard, for instance, on the book project we were just discussing a moment ago, Presidential Prerogatives, you know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is one of the heroes in my family. My grandfather had, you know, his portrait up and, you know, always reflected on the fact that he never had a holiday until FDR was president and so forth. And it turns out that when one starts digging through the archives and so forth, the one president of all four who showed the least restraint in office and looks the worst in terms of trying to balance freedom and security was indeed FDR. So
disappointment for the family hero.
Yeah, that's indeed correct.
Yeah, I'm afraid we're going to have to stop there, Dan, but could
Absolutely.
you tell me when this book might be available so that we can follow up by reading it?
Well, I'm actually going to be finishing writing it this summer.
Okay,
so I would anticipate that it would probably be available a year after that,
okay,
given the timeline of academic presses. But
we will look forward to it, and thank you very much for coming to talk about it today.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Sure, come back sometime soon.
Look forward to it.
We've been speaking with Daniel Tichenor, Senior Faculty Fellow at the Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics, and the Philip H. Knight Professor of Social Science in the Department of Political Science. Thanks very much for watching.